When you watch mainstream media, it feels like we're like in an apocalypse. The world is coming to an end. But somehow, if you can get outside of that news cycle, there's some very interesting things being discovered. I thought this was an incredible revelation in this article by The Telegraph, and there's other doctors now supporting this idea around the world. Coronavirus has downgraded from tiger to wildcat and could die out without vaccine. Infectious disease specialist Professor Matteo Bassetti says COVID-19 has been losing its virulence. It goes on to say, Professor Matteo, head of the infectious disease clinic at the Policlinico San Martino Hospital in Italy, told The Telegraph that COVID-19 has been losing its virulence in the last month, and patients who would have previously died are now recovering. It was like an aggressive tiger in March and April, but now it's like a wildcat. Even elderly patients aged 80 or 90 are now sitting up in bed, and they are breathing without help. The same patients would have died in 2 or 3 days before. That's an incredible revelation. And to be honest, for those of us that have worked on the doctor's television show for, 6 to 10 years of our lives, you would know that this is actually the natural course for most viruses. Viruses evolve to be less and less deadly. If you think about it, it's an evolutionary process that makes sense. If a virus kills its host, it kills itself off. And so it would stand to reason, as we look through the history of most viruses, that they get less and less virulent and less deadly so that they can proliferate and reach more parts of the world. Here we go. Tiger is turning into a little wildcat. Now, whether or not this is true or not, there is definitely something going on. We either can attribute what they're saying to it becoming less virulent. Maybe it was never that virulent at all. Maybe we're simply getting better at treating it. We've talked about all of the different things about treatment. The point being that maybe we're just treating this better. There's multiple reasons for this, but this is coming out of Italy, and you may say to yourself, well, that's not the case in America. Well, in America, we're not getting that headline. Instead, you have to put a few headlines together to come to exactly that same conclusion. Like this. Take a look at the headlines we're reading this week. What we're reading is that the U.S. hit its highest single day of coronavirus cases at 36,358, breaking the April record. So we have more cases than ever. Arizona, Florida, California, and Nevada report record high single-day increases in coronavirus cases. We're going crazy over this. We're reinstating mask laws. We're absolutely out of our minds. Governor Abbott in Texas is under siege. You're gonna get us all killed. Many of these reports are saying that one of the highest growing groups of infections is in young adults. Young people in the U.S. South and West are increasingly getting coronavirus. Now, I want to point something out here, folks. They've done a bait and switch on you, right? They've done a bait and switch. We talked about deadly pandemic, the pandemic of the century, and deadly, and the death rate, and the death numbers. Well, they just switched out that word death numbers and replaced it with infection numbers or cases. What is a case? Well, a case is someone that goes to a, pop-up clinic and says, yeah, test my blood. Oh, my God, I have it? That's weird. I don't even have any symptoms. Okay, well, I guess I'll stay at home for a little while. I mean, that's what's really going on, right? Essentially, what's happening is the highest number of people in the history of the pandemic now in America have now tested positive for the sniffles. That's what's going on. And yet, that's not what your mainstream media is telling you. Now, you got your president of the United States trying to tell you, hey, folks, we are testing more people. This is why we're getting more cases. You would think that would logically go together, but nobody seems to care. What they should really care about is this headline. The headline that media ignores the fact that 90% of coronavirus death collapse in country. We are 90%, we dropped down in our death rate. 90% lower death rate than we were at just a few short weeks ago. You see, folks, look at this. Here's the graph. It is going, we've been reporting this to you. This isn't brand new news to you people watching the High Wire, but death is crashing. That's all that actually matters. Now, remember, when you're looking at that, maybe the virus is less deadly, or maybe we're just actually not venting people anymore and killing them at a rate of 9 out of 10. Maybe that could have something to do with it. I don't know. It's just a theory. since we do know the NIH came out and said, you know what, as it turns out, the vents weren't such a good idea, killing lots of people. So maybe doctors are trying something like oxygen instead of killing them with vents. That could contribute to it. And another thing I want to point out is we look in Texas, and I'm watching the news. They're saying, oh my God, we're on the verge of a shortage of beds. But when you look at the shortage of beds, what they're saying is the shortage of beds in the ICU. Why are we still treating this as though it's an ICU incident when it has a death rate of 0.26% amongst the very, very unhealthy, pharmaceutical-dependent people among us? For the rest of us, this is the sniffles. Maybe they can use a regular bed where you seem to have thousands of those. None of this makes any sense. None of this reporting is getting us where we need to be. Because the truth is, more and more headlines are starting to back away from the idea that we're going to have a successful vaccine. They're starting to really hedge their bets. You got guys like Paul Offit, who we pointed out, is saying, we better slow this down. We need this thing to be tested for a couple of years. And by the way, let me remind you that MERS and SARS and the other coronaviruses, they didn't last more than 2 years. And they did probably what we're seeing this one do. They get less and less virulent, and they just disappear. Well, we want them to disappear as quickly as we can. And obviously, the vaccine will not be the fastest way to do that, because if it's going to be tested for safety, it needs to be tested for at least 2 or 3 years. And now they're saying we don't even know if the infection, the effectiveness will last more than a year. It could be a lot like a flu shot where it's only 10% effective. You see, these are all the problems. And are we going to really make public policy over a vaccine that, number one, doesn't exist, may never come, may not actually be effective enough or last long enough to do anything for anybody? Meanwhile, every day, folks, we are destroying our economy. We are getting dangerously close to what my understanding is a very, very bad number for America. If we hit 50 million unemployed in this country, it's game over. We're over the fulcrum point. You can't get that back. Meanwhile, I've told you, China is ramping up. China is back in business. China is manufacturing. Where are our manufacturing jobs going to go? What is going to happen in the United States of America? While you think you're a hero in your mask, locked in your basement, and you want to celebrate Andrew Cuomo essentially killing people in nursing homes, you may really want to ask yourself, a 0.26% death rate? I should be afraid of that and take on the greatest depression this generation and everyone alive has ever seen in the United States of America. You ready for that? Is that where we're going? Now, all of this took on a really dynamic perspective for me just earlier this week. If you haven't noticed, we are getting so much information. This show, I'm going to try to keep it to 2 hours. There's so much to do. I need more staff. I need your help. But we're starting to put out special reports. Some things we just couldn't fit in last week's show and doesn't seem to fit what we're talking about here. Of course, I'm talking about my interview with Mark Blaxell and his brilliant paper, which came out and was discussing, amongst many things, the data coming out, the drop in infant deaths, the drop in SIDS, in this incredible article, Lessons from the Lockdown, which you can get at healthchoice.org. A brilliant, brilliant article that gets into a lot of data points. Mostly, we got focused on the drop in SIDS, which is phenomenal and an incredible accidental experiment that's going on. You should read all about it. But I want to talk about something else. Right as I was talking to him, this graph popped up where he was just talking about deaths in America. And I have to tell you, this graph has kept me up at night. I've been staring at my ceiling as I think about it. Let me just go to the board. Can we get this on the back wall? I want to talk about, okay, this is the U.S. deaths per week in the United States of America. As we've told you, 90% drop off. I guess we can celebrate this, right? This is where we're at. This is where we're coming into now. But this is where every other, virus and thing, this is where we should be. Now, remember, we're in, we're moving into July. So to have a flu outbreak, basically spring, summer, obviously this rarely happens. This should have been happening back in, December, November. Back in there is where we usually see something like this. So it's in the wrong place to begin with. That was one thing that I started thinking about. But then I just started asking myself, what happened here? What happened right here that all of a sudden people start dropping like flies in the United States of America? Now, you want to say, well, hey, it was right about then that coronavirus hit America, right? And we know that it takes about 2 weeks to kick in, so maybe we could go back 2 weeks and right in here, you know, should have started this spike and then bam, everybody started dying. But that is not actually the case. In fact, the more and more this is being investigated, the more articles you read, you'll recognize that China and France are starting to look and see cases all the way back in November. France has cases that date back to November, they believe. So does Wuhan, China. Remember, we have airplanes, folks. We live in a world where people have been flying from China into California and into New York all the way back in November where those first cases seem to be. And by the way, more and more scientists are demanding that we start testing blood banks to see if it goes back even further before that, because what this looks like is a coronavirus, which is usually at the same time as a flu season. This should have happened back in the fall and winter of last year. It's in the wrong place. Now what I want you to think about is even in the United States of America, we now have a case in California that dates back to early February. I believe it's February 6th, nearly 3 weeks before deaths in Washington were reported. Now remember, that's a death in February 6th, which means if you go back at least 2 weeks before that person would have contracted it to get to the point of death. And what that article went on to say is this person didn't travel. So they must have gotten it from somebody else who had to have had it 2 weeks earlier or something like that. And how many of those people were there? You see, what we're seeing is that this virus goes back to at least the beginning of January, if not the winter for us here in America. Okay? Do you see where I'm going with this? Now, I want you to look at one more article from Penn State because this plays into my entire thought that has got me awake at night. Look at this. Initial COVID-19 infection rate may be 80 times greater than originally reported. It goes on to say, now a new study from Penn State estimates that the number of early COVID-19 cases in the U.S. may have been more than 80 times greater and doubled nearly twice as fast as originally believed. In a paper published today, June 22nd, in the journal Science Translational Medicine, researchers estimated the detection rate of symptomatic COVID-19 cases using the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's influenza-like illness surveillance data over a 3-week period in March 2020. Remember, this is how it would have been reported early on, would have been an influenza-like illness. Remarkably, the size of the observed surge of excess influenza-like illnesses corresponds to more than 8.7 million new cases during the last 3 weeks of March, compared to the roughly 100,000 cases that were officially reported during the same time period. In New York, for example, researchers' model suggested that at least 9% of the state's entire population was infected by the end of March. After the state conducted antibody testing on 3,000 residents, they found 13.9% infection rate, or 2.7 million New Yorkers. Here is what I want to pose to you. Here is my question, because as I was talking to Mark Blexel, what he said is, when we look at this spike, we also see a spike that goes up and above our all-cause mortality. It looks just like this too, meaning we have all the reasons we die that usually track. You can look back through the years, and we actually see a spike of that too, which means that COVID-19 and this pandemic did have a high death rate that affected our overall death rate. Proof that it was there. But my question is this: is this death technically by a natural functioning COVID-19 virus? Or is this a death rate of what I would call panic? Panic is what I believe you are looking at here. Because if you think about it, this is not where the virus enters in. We were already tracking a virus. It was already here. When? All the way back in January, at the very least. Can we bring in the dotted line? Why is this not the arc that we saw? Remember, they're describing it as 80 times more infectious, doubling at twice the rate that we ever imagined. This was what was supposed to be happening here. So when it comes, and we knew it was here, and maybe even back as far as November, we might even find last September, why weren't we seeing the deaths start to climb up here? Remember, at first it would be like, I don't know, there's a weird thing, people are dying, and we don't know why. And then maybe in here we start discovering, oh my goodness, it's that same virus they had in Wuhan, China. And then it gets up to this point. This, in my mind, should be what had happened if this virus truly is the pandemic of the century, the most deadly and contagious virus as it's been described by Tony Fauci, Bill Gates. If that was true, how the heck did it hide down here for more than 3 months? How is this possible? Where was it? It's spreading like crazy and nobody is dying, not until here? Well, what happened here? What happened here was the beginning of our approach. Our medical plan began right here. Not the virus, not the entry into the world. Our approach to the virus begins right here, designed by Tony Fauci, supported by guys like Andrew Cuomo. Let me make this point. What am I talking about? Look at this. This, week 11, is when the lockdown begins. This is when the U.S. says this is how we're going to deal with the virus. For the first time ever, we are not going to let this virus run its course like every other coronavirus in history, and the flu for that matter. We're going to interject ourselves. We are going to try and stop nature from happening, and we're going to do it right here, right before the spike begins. And then, oh, we have another great decision. Let's be so terrified of running out of hospital beds that we force nursing homes to take on sick patients. And then, boom, what did you do? You lit a match in a dry grass field. The one field we knew was at risk, the nursing homes, over 65 years old with comorbidities. Andrew Cuomo and the other 4 governors now apparently going to be under investigation. Why? Why did you put it, as a threat, the one group we knew had to be protected? I'll tell you why. Because they were freaked out of their minds going, oh my God, we're going to run out of beds. We're going to run out of beds. And so in order to avoid running out of beds, which, by the way, only the beds in their ICU, right? Only the beds in their ICU, not the entire hospital. No, just the ICU. Why are we using the ICU? Because someone said this virus is so deadly, you can't give people any oxygen. It might aerosolize. See, the panic was all set off by essentially screaming fire in a crowded room. This is not a pandemic. This is not COVID-19. This is being trampled because some idiot said, we're all gonna die. And every medical professional started treating the world as though everyone was going to die. That's what happened right here. And bam, you have this crazy, unnatural, in a couple of weeks, devastating death spiral. That's what happened here. How else can we look at this? Let me make this perfectly clear. I believe there were 5 steps that essentially contributed to one of the worst panic-demics of all times. Here's the top 5 reasons I believe this happened. Number 1, because you were panicked, you forced infected people into nursing homes. I think this will go down in history as one of the greatest mistakes in history. Okay, number 2, you reduced your hospital staff. In the middle of an issue where a lot of people were catching this cold and some were having a serious reaction, you basically shut down to your ER and ICU and sent everybody else home. So no one got any of the other treatments. You didn't have available nurses and people to use all the beds in the hospital, so you were running low. You never ran completely low. You never ran out of beds altogether, but you reduced your own hospital staff. Makes no sense. And then what did you do? You normally would have given them oxygen, but instead you put them on ventilators and started killing them 9 out of 10. Oh, and then as though that's not bad enough, you're killing them with a ventilator. Let's definitely not try to resuscitate them after they do somehow succumb, like the story we heard from Nurse Erin that said a 47-year-old that the family wanted them to be resuscitated, but the hospital said that's just not our policy during COVID-19. And then lastly, you restricted use of hydroxychloroquine, where everyone else in the world is saying is a very effective treatment. I could probably make a much longer list, but this basically gives you the gist of it. So take me back to Mark's original. It's really the CDC's graph. When we see this and we look back in history, the question I want to ask you is, what would have happened if Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx and Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom and everybody in the country just never knew that we had a deadly coronavirus? What if we just thought it was a normal coronavirus? And by the way, people with heart disease and COPD and diabetes and obesity die from the common cold every single year. Was this in higher numbers? Well, it certainly was when we panicked about it. But what if we never knew? What if we right here didn't put everyone on a ventilator, but instead just gave them oxygen? What if we immediately gave them some antivirals, maybe in some places some intravenous vitamin C if you really wanted to get out there and try something natural? What if you didn't send people into nursing homes so that you could free up beds because you thought this was a deadly virus? What if none of those things happened and you had a fully staffed hospital and all the beds available and all the drugs you needed to take care of it? Is it possible that this thing would have just gone along like it does every single year? Unfortunately for us, we will never know because the panic took hold. I don't just blame Andrew Cuomo. You're watching it right now. The media caused this. The media used this to take away your rights, to make you panic, to sell more diapers and drugs on television so that you had nothing to do but watch TV. And their desire to have your mind riveted to their fear-mongering, we killed how many people? And by the way, is there going to be a second wave as we decide to treat this next wave the same way of young adults that are going to be just fine? The death rate is infinitesimal right now. This is a wildcat. Maybe it was always a wildcat until someone decided to poke that thing with an electric taser and turn it into a tiger. If you like that clip, then be sure to check out our live broadcast of The High Wire every Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. You can watch it on Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, and Twitter. We'll see you there.